Welcome to another edition of George Washington Speaks. I'm Tom Saffold. In colonial America, local dances provided important social opportunities, and the ambitious young George Washington did not want to miss them. But his family's poverty and his own social awkwardness created some problems. In this edition, George Washington will share how he dealt with these challenges, and he'll describe something that would prove more important than attending a dance. As an aside, it is the goal of George Washington Speaks to keep as close as we can to the historic data that is available to us. Washington's youth is the one area of his life that we have the least amount of information. In this edition, we take what historical and cultural data we have and place George in real-life situations of growing physically and being socially awkward and having to make a difficult decision quickly. What will he do? What would you do?
My lack of education, social status, wealth, and prospects did not keep me from attending as many social events as I could throughout the year. The most important events were the dances, because that is where I could meet other young people that were in my social class. Young men like myself, without wealth or status, could still marry into a wealthy family. That is, if a well-to-do family had no sons but a plentiful amount of daughters, a portion of a father's wealth could legally be transferred to the husband of one of their daughters, which would make up for my poverty. This was not the only reason I went, but I knew it was a possibility if I was found to be acceptable to some young lady and her family. It was not easy for me to attend dances, because between the ages of 11 and 14, I had grown quite tall. Now, this may not sound like a bad thing, but with each growth spurt, my clothing became more tight and ill-fitting. My mother would do what she could to alter my original clothing, such as lengthening the sleeves or the breeches, but the real problem was that my chest and my shoulders kept getting larger, and my arms and my thighs, well, they continued to become more muscular. And that meant that the vest, the coat, the breeches were almost impossible to let out, and we just didn't have the money to buy new clothing. Since I continued to grow, I found that I was at least a head taller than the other 11 to 14-year-olds, and that I was even taller than many of the older boys. The younger boys admired me, but to me, it only pointed out the poverty of my clothing. My coat and my breeches showed the constant efforts of my mother to let out my clothing, and the patchwork done to cover the worn areas sometimes shone. At each dance, I seemed to get bigger and became more painfully aware of the looks that some of the older boys gave me. I also saw the smirks on their faces and heard their laughter, which as a young gentleman they should have tried to hide, but they did not. And that was the worst wounds of all. In addition to the dances, the young people would gather at summer outdoor events for other socially acceptable activities. For the boys, that would be competing in races of all kinds, throwing heavy metal rods as far as they could, and wrestling. I enjoyed wrestling the most, especially with those older boys who thought me to be beneath them at the dances because of my poverty and inferior clothing. You see, wrestling was a very popular sport, and the adults, and I think maybe the girls, well, of course the girls too, would crowd around the wrestlers and enjoyed watching the boys and young men display their strength and maturing manliness. So, while wrestling those young men that had snubbed me at the dances, I did not have to be embarrassed by my strength or my size. I just had to be a gentleman sportsman. I did, perhaps, find great satisfaction in my wrestling successes over those older young men who had been unkind to me at a dance. I really enjoyed that. However, my wrestling ability did nothing to remove my lack of social awkwardness that became apparent as we got older and the dances became more difficult and the interactions, the talking and small talk were more socially demanding of me. My size continued to be very noticeable and drew attention. I looked older than I was, and the other boys and girls, and even the adults, expected me to think and act like I was a more mature young man of 16 or 17, when I was actually only 14 or 15. To make matters worse, I was naturally shy. It's true. Paired with my lack of education and my social uneasiness, I had no confidence in myself. You can imagine how deathly afraid I was of saying anything that might embarrass myself or others, and which might make others laugh at me or make fun of me. And dancing in front of large crowds increased my uneasiness. The thought of additional ridicule if I happened to trip or stumble or step on somebody's foot was almost unbearable for me. But I overcame my fear, and I went anyway. I had a deep desire to be both accepted and to be included in the adult community and by those of my own age. I remember one of those dances in the summer of my 14th year. I was standing along the wall of the dance hall watching the more accomplished young people dance. A couple of girls came up to me and they began to talk to me and ask me questions. They were attractive and well-dressed, and I greatly enjoyed their attention. I did keep my answers to their questions short in order to limit anything I might say that I could be made fun of. After a few minutes, a much shorter boy than I came along, looked me up and down, and then smiled. He turned to the girls, and he said some witty things to them, whereupon they laughed gaily, and then all of three of them quickly disappeared into the crowd. I was deflated. One moment, I thought that I was surrounded by two potential friends. Then in the very next moment, I was completely alone again, feeling helpless and embarrassed. I didn't know what I had done wrong, but I felt that everyone was aware of my clumsiness, and I could feel the heat of my red cheeks burning from embarrassment. Toward the end of the dance, a pleasant-looking girl came up to me, and we started to talk. She didn't have the bubbly personality of the other two girls, but she was nice, and I felt comfortable and at ease with her. The dance was ending, and she asked if I was going to be at the next dance at Christmas. And I said yes, that I had planned to be there. She no doubt knew how shy I was, because she asked me if I would dance with her at that dance. I, with wide eyes, responded yes. Most assuredly, I said to myself. I don't remember the hour-and-a-half horse ride back to the fairy farm, but I do remember all of the possibilities that one short conversation put into my head. Those weeks between that dance and Christmas time was the slowest time of my life. I didn't even remember her name, but she appeared to be from a fine family, and it was not unusual that marriages resulted from two people meeting at a dance. So my thinking was not without merit. After those several months, December finally came, and my mother had been selling some of her own property in order to pay all of our bills. I knew there was no money for new clothing, but that did not matter to me. My hopes were at the dance. I may have a future after all. But when I went out to the barn to saddle the horse and ride to the dance, I found that there had been very little hay for the horse to eat all day. Riding the poor horse for an hour and a half to the dance, having him stand 2 to 3 hours outside in the freezing cold of December, and then riding him another hour and a half back home might be too much for him. Without the warmth that the fermenting hay in his stomach would give him, his age, and 9 miles of frozen, rutted, and dangerous country roads, an injury or possibly worse to the horse was a real possibility. I had a decision to make. Would I go to the dance and enjoy the company of this young lady who might be my future? Or would I risk the health and possibly a severe injury to the horse? My family and the 10 slaves depended on the horse for farm work and transportation. If something happened to the horse, we had no money to buy another one. The loss would impact my family and the farm laborers. But do I go to the dance and ride toward my future, or do I stay home and miss a very pleasant dance? Do I go and take the risk for myself and my future, or do I stay and not risk the health and well-being of the horse and my family? Now that is a lot for a 14-year-old to think about and to decide. Well, let me ask you, what would you do? Would you go? Would you stay? Well, I will tell you what I did. I did not go. I stayed. Why? Because the commitment to my family was more important to me than the remote chance that the nameless girl might become a suitable wife.
Even in his youth, George Washington showed a level of responsibility and consideration for others that reflected his developing character. These traits would mature him into the leader of the colonies needed for their fight for independence. But that was still many years away. However, it's still true today that decisions you make in your youth, even seemingly minor decisions about attending a dance, can have lasting consequences. Did you know that at one time, George Washington intended to join the British Navy? Listen to the next edition of George Washington Speaks to hear about another youthful decision he made.